All right, our next speaker is Madeline Drake. Madeline Drake, the Assistant Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitat at the California Natural Resources Agency. And in this capacity, she advises and coordinates with external stakeholders and CNRA departments, boards, and conservancies to implement California's 30 by 30 strategy. Before this role, Madeline served as the Biodiversity Coordinator for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, where she led the team that developed Pathways to 30 by 30 document, the strategic framework for conserving 30% of California's land and coastal waters by 2030. Prior to her time at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, she worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where she was a senior biologist working on Endangered Species Act listing determinations and recovery actions for threatened and endangered species. Madeline received her Bachelor's of Science in Marine Science from the University of South Carolina and a Master of Science in Animal Biology from the University of California, Davis. Madeline.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. It's great to be here. I love the opportunity to talk about the intersection of biodiversity and climate together. You can go to the next slide, please. So here in California, we're very lucky to live in one of the most biodiverse states on Earth. We are home to 6,500 types of different plants, and roughly 40% of those are only found here in California. We're also home to the tallest, largest, and oldest tree species, and we are so biodiverse because we have an exceptional amount of habitat here. We have mountains, coastlines, deserts, and those span from the highest to the lowest elevations in the contiguous United States. Next slide, please. You can go to the next one. So just so we're on the same page of what I mean when we're talking about biodiversity. Well, biodiversity refers to the variety of life from genes to species to ecosystems. Next slide, please. Because California is such an exceptional place of biodiversity, we're actually one of 36 global biodiversity hotspots around the globe. These places are only 2.5% of the land mass on Earth, but they support more than half of the Earth's plant species, as well as 43% of birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibian species. Next slide, please. But being a biodiversity hotspot is both a good and a bad thing. As I already mentioned, we have exceptional biodiversity and a high percentage of species that are found nowhere else on Earth. However, it also means that our biodiversity is threatened, with 30% or less of its original vegetation left. Next slide, please. So, because we have exceptional biodiversity, there's a lot at risk of losing. In an article published in the New York Times this past summer, that utilized information from a 2022 scientific paper that did a habitat suitability model on more than 2,200 different species nationwide, California has the most imperiled biodiversity of any state in the contiguous United States. This is due to the number of species that are threatened by things like habitat loss and climate change. Next slide, please. So why does it matter, and what do we stand to lose? I like this simple cartoon because it kind of, in an oversimplified way, explains that ecosystems are complex. There's a lot we still don't know. And as we start to lose species to extinction, any one of them could cause a catastrophic collapse of healthy and functioning ecosystems. Next slide, please. And as you all know, I'm assuming you all know, nature and functioning ecosystems are critical to human and health well-being. We rely on nature for our food, our medicines, housing, clothing, even the air we breathe. There continues to be growing research that we also rely on nature for our mental well-being as well. So next slide, please. Specific to climate change, and I know nature-based solutions was brought up by our first speaker, forests play a critical role in regulating global climate. They absorb carbon from the atmosphere and then store it in our soils and act as natural carbon sinks. Achieving net zero carbon emissions will depend on these Earth's natural carbon sinks. So nature itself is one of the key tools in our toolbox to combat climate change. Next slide, please. So what can we do knowing that we rely on biodiversity for healthy functioning ecosystems, and we have such great biodiversity here in California, but that it's under threat? Well, it's not all doom and gloom yet. Next slide, please. Scientists from all over the world have come together with the goal of conserving 30% of our Earth's lands and coastal waters by 2030 so that we have a fighting chance against these biodiversity and climate crises. And I know Caitlin talked about this a little bit already too. But at the United Nations Conference of Parties in December of 2022, or COP15, almost 200 countries came together worldwide and signed a global biodiversity framework recognizing the importance of biodiversity, including the commitment to this 30 by 30 goal globally. Next slide, please. California, being the 5th largest economy in the world, and as I already discussed, a biodiversity hotspot, wanted to be a part of that solution. Even before this global biodiversity framework was signed, Governor Newsom signed Executive Order N8220 in October of 2020, committing the state to conserving 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030. This goal is also now state law, I'm glad to say, thanks to Senate Bill 337 from Senator Min that was signed just this past fall. After a year of extensive public comment and engagement process, California released its Pathways to 30 by 30 strategy in April of 2022, describing 10 pathways the state can take to achieve this goal in order to protect and restore our biodiversity, expand equitable access to nature, and to mitigate and build resilience to climate change. In May of 2023, so just this past year, we released our first annual progress report, and that added 631,000 acres of conserved areas in our first year of implementation, bringing our total to 24.4% of lands and 16.2% of coastal waters. We still have 5.5 million acres of land left to conserve in California and 500,000 acres of coastal waters. Next slide, please. But how can we tell if the areas we are conserving for 30 by 30 are actually meeting these biodiversity and climate goals? Well, there are 3 levels of indicators, and this kind of refers back to that definition of biodiversity. The first is ecosystem biodiversity, looking at changes or shifts in habitats. The second is species diversity, looking at abundance and distribution of species. And the third is genetic diversity, looking at things like fitness and adaptation. And we get this type of information from a variety of sources, including our academic and NGO partners. Next slide, please. We're lucky to work very closely with a group called the California Biodiversity Network, which is a group that brings together key environmental experts and community leaders who are united to conserve California's biodiversity. This group has 4 key focus areas they call roundtables, which bring together academic NGO scientists as well as some government scientists as well. The Systematic Conservation Planning Roundtable is focused on data, analyses, and tools to identify spatial opportunities for conservation that are important for biodiversity. The Climate Biodiversity Sentinel Site Roundtable is focused on building consistent and collaborative long-term monitoring framework to be used across the state by a variety of different partners so that we can improve our long-term data sets for climate and biodiversity. The Biodiversity Informatics and Community Science Roundtable is focused on ensuring both historical records, like things housed at museums, as well as research and data points collected by communities themselves, and making sure that that information can be utilized in a way that's informing decision making. And finally, the Stewardship Roundtable is focused on a community of practice for most effectively managing and caring for the lands based on the needs of biodiversity, climate, and access. And these groups do have an equity forum that comes together periodically to make sure that all of these different roundtables are centered around equity and the work that they're doing and being more inclusive as we continue to progress in that field. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned already, but we have so many amazing government scientists that we rely on. And one example that I want to highlight is California Department of Fish and Wildlife's Biodiversity and Climate Sentinel Site Network. And they're working very closely with those academic and NGO partners as part of the California Biodiversity Network as well. But these are weather stations, acoustic recorders, camera traps, and MODIS towers to track species movement set out on CDFW properties all across the state. And these are going to be really key in collecting long-term data that's going to establish a crucial understanding of how ecosystems change over time at local, regional, and statewide scales. And this information is going to be really key to informing management and decision-making regarding conserving biodiversity. Next slide, please. And then another key information provider is our community scientists. And this field is quickly growing and evolving. New science coming out all the time on how we can better utilize this information. I think there's so much potential here too, because we're getting communities involved, getting them to learn, to care about the things that I do. I'm sure many of you do too. And just getting them more involved. So things like the City Nature Challenge, the Snapshot Cal Coast, are getting people out there and are continually growing and sort of improving the data that we can really utilize for biodiversity. Next slide, please. So the last thing I want to focus on in my talk is what are some of the key biodiversity indicators and topics of 2023. And these are kind of the key hot topics that I feel like crossed through my desk over the past year that I think are going to be really important moving forward as we continue to look at how biodiversity and climate interact with each other. Next slide, please. The first is soil biodiversity. I see a lot of new research coming out on the importance of this topic, both understanding how much is there, what is there, as well as the impacts of climate change. I've highlighted a couple new papers that came out this past year on the slide that are really looking at this relationship. And you might recall earlier that I brought up the importance of soils acting as natural carbon sinks. So improved understanding is especially important for our ability to combat climate change, is understanding the soil biodiversity. In July of 2023, our sister agency, the California Department of Food and Agriculture, released a report discussing soil biodiversity and framework indicators to assess soil health. A lot of this was focused on agriculture, but many of these ideas can be used statewide. Next slide, please. The next one is connectivity, and I think this has been a hot topic for several years. This is nothing new, but one thing that's really exciting and the reason it remains at the top of the list, and it goes really well, is we're now seeing a lot of science turned into action. So there's a couple papers that have come out that have talked about, as we continue to improve species connectivity, but I have some pictures of here that shows how that science is actually being improved and implemented today. So one is a picture of a mountain lion from a new crossing that just went in under Highway 17 in Santa Cruz County. It just opened in the spring, and they were quickly seeing animals using that crossing, improving connectivity and species' ability to adapt to climate change. The other is the removal of the Klamath Dam. We all know this is going to be really important for connectivity for fish species and the overall health of that river and the communities that depend on that river. And we saw so much progress in the removal of this dam this past year. So this is a great example of that science really being put into action. And I want to highlight that CDFW, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, is working very closely on this topic. They released a priority barriers report, or a Restoring California's Wildlife Connectivity report, highlighting areas across the state based on science that we can continue to improve in this. Next slide, please. I wanted to highlight new technology being advanced that will continue to improve how efficiently and effectively we can utilize data to inform biodiversity and climate change. Things like satellite imagery to more quickly evaluate ecosystem change are being implemented and talked about every day. There's also regenerative artificial intelligence, which scares me a little, but I'm excited to jump into what we can do there for tools for how they can help analyze large amounts of data that are being recorded, like our camera traps and acoustic recorders. For example, that CDFW Climate and Biodiversity Sentinel Site Network, they're already using an AI platform called Wildlife Insights that has significantly reduced the processing time and the ability for them to gather information from those sites quickly. Next slide, please. And lastly, there continues to be a need for interdisciplinary work to be a key topic moving forward. We're gaining improved understanding on financial impacts of biodiversity due to climate change, a better understanding of mental health benefits of nature exposure, and we're continuing to improve and better understand how even biodiversity data and the way we use it for decision making can lead to inequities. A great quote from a new paper in Science that I think just came out a couple weeks ago summed it up really well, that moving beyond quick technical fixes will require connecting strategically with community-based partners, and we continue to do our work to try to do better in that area. So a lot of progress has been made, but we still have a long way to go. Next slide, please. So to stay informed on the work that we're doing on biodiversity in California, including our 30 by 30 initiative, I encourage you to check out our website, californianature.ca.gov. A lot of what I talked about today can be found on that website, and there's also information for how you can get in touch with our team if you have any questions or ideas on how we can do better at the intersection of biodiversity and climate. So thank you all so much.